Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly. And on this episode, I'm joined by Joe Mahler. Joe shares his fly fishing journey from fishing farm ponds in the Midwest as a kid to his career as an illustrator, an outdoor writer, and a teaching guide. But before we move on to the interview, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you like the podcast, please subscribe in the podcatcher of your choice and leave us a review. It would really help us out. And a shout out to this episode's sponsor. This episode's brought to you by our friends at the Bristol Bay Defense Fund. With the decision on the Pebble Mine's most critical federal permit application due later this year, 2020 is an important turning point in this long-running saga. To help this diverse coalition continue its efforts to protect one of the world's largest wild salmon runs and all of its economic, cultural, and ecological benefits, please visit www.bristolbaydefensefund.com and donate today. Now, on to our interview. Well, welcome to The Articulate Fly, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our chat, and we have a tradition on The Articulate Fly. I always ask all of my guests to share their earliest fishing memory.
You know, mine is a very clear memory. On my third or fourth birthday, when I was back in Indiana, and my Uncle Ralph got me a Zebco small rod and reel for my birthday present, and we had a picnic, and we were in a small pond in Spencer, Indiana. I remember him. It was a top water experience, so he got the lawnmower out and cut the edge of the grass, and I remember all the grasshoppers and stuff going in the water, and the fish coming up, boiling at him. I remember my uncle saying, "Just drop it in the water," and I did, and the bobber went down, and I have a picture on my wall of probably a 14 or 15-inch bass.
Yeah, that's awesome. My first bass was on a cane pole on the Bicentennial, but it was about 12 inches if you stood on it to make it the limit.
Right.
And so when did you move to the dark side of fly fishing?
Well, when I was 12 years old, I don't know why. I think I'd seen the American Sportsman or something, and I saw somebody fly fishing. And for whatever reason, that caught my attention. And we had a guy in the neighborhood who was kind of a jack of all trades, knew about everything. And I remember blurting out that, I want to fly fish. And I remember him saying, "You could never do that because, you don't have the patience." And since I've learned that it's the perfect thing for somebody who doesn't have patience, because you're constantly moving, and I was fidgety then, I'm fidgety now, and it's always been the perfect therapy for me.
That's great. And who are some of the folks that mentored you on your fly fishing journey?
My Uncle Ralph and my mom, they were both. They would fish in a mud puddle. It just didn't matter. So neither one of them really fly fished. But from an early age, in Indiana, if there was a farm pond someplace, my mom could figure out how to get permission to get on it. She knew most every farmer. So from there, the Indianapolis Flycasters had so many great people that I got to meet, and a fellow named Charlie Weidman, who was a farmer. He and I used to spend a lot of time hitting those farm ponds, and that's even more so than the technique and the learning how to cast. For me, the whole thing was the attitude of fly fishing. That's what the mentors to me that I think, Charlie Weidman. There was a fellow named Doc Asher who was, it was just such a nice gentleman's sport, and it was just the things that went with fly fishing that have always attracted me as much as the mechanics.
Very neat. And I know you're an illustrator by trade. Was art always a part of your life as well?
It was. In the time before video games and stuff, my father was a sign painter and a policeman. And, when the power would go out, or what we did in the evening was sit around with paper and draw. And that's what we did when we were kids. And we just drew and drew and drew. When you say art, I would say illustration has been, we would illustrate stories or make up stories and draw the characters and that sort of thing. To me, that's not really art. I'm not a painter or that sort of thing. If I had a day off, I wouldn't paint a picture. I'd go fishing. And so for me, illustration has always been, I've always thought of it like a language, just like Spanish or French or something. And it's just another way to communicate things. So without something to communicate, I'm not sure I would pick up a pencil.
Got it. And did you kind of, as you graduated from the dinner table after dinner as a kid, did you have formal training to illustrate, or were you self-taught?
I didn't, like I said, I just grew up with, and I used to help my dad paint signs and that sort of stuff. So I had some real nuts and bolts training by the time it was time to go into the workforce. And I got a very lucky break and got an internship at a large department store, which was downtown Indianapolis, called Blocks. And I worked in the advertising department. So that was when I was a senior in high school. I'd work half days there and go. It was called a co-op program, and I would go to school half days and go to work in advertising the other half. So by the time I got done with that, it had been a real fast-paced. I understood how work gets done and how it needs to get done and how quickly it needs to get done. So I just really didn't go to school after that.
Got it. And, anyone in the fly fishing world that sees an illustration instantly knows it's one of yours. You have a very distinct style. How did that develop?
That developed from doing storyboards over the years. I don't know if you're familiar with storyboards, but in TV commercials, or movies or something like that, they're a series of sketches are done to communicate, a camera move or something. Those pictures that you do, then maybe in a 30-second spot, maybe there'll be a dozen of them. They have to communicate very clearly what's going on and what the next move is, and so that's what it was for me. I started doing that at pretty early. My very first job, I did the pictures for the insides of televisions for newspaper ads. So if it was seasonal, I would draw skiers inside the little, the clip art for the televisions, and so everything for me always had to be very clear what was going on, or to demonstrate a certain concept or something very specific. So I love doing the casting illustrations are really challenging because you're showing movement. You're showing some really, really complex things. And so, in 3 or 4, showing movement in illustration to me is probably the most interesting and most challenging.
And how do you break that down to figure out kind of which kind of snapshots of the motion you want to capture?
A couple of different ways. Sometimes I'll go out and shoot. Have my wife shoot some cell phone videos, and I'll watch it and watch it and watch it, and follow it very closely and work from that. Sometimes it's just something that I want to demonstrate an idea, and so maybe that's a little bit looser, a little more dramatic, maybe.
Yeah, got it. And you mentioned at the beginning of the interview that you're a Hoosier. How did you end up in Southwest Florida?
My wife told me that we were moving here. Is how that happened. So I'd taken a job up in Wisconsin as a creative director at an ad agency for a couple of years, and we were sitting in Applebee's with 13 below temperatures, and I may have said let's move to Florida, but I'm not. I can't be sure. All I know is the next day that most of our belongings were on eBay, and there was a truck scheduled to move us to Southwest Florida. My in-laws live down here, and so we were, we wanted to be a little closer to them as well. Truth of the matter is, I had no interest in moving down here because I didn't, what I had always seen was strip malls and golf courses, and I don't really spend much time at either one. But when I got down here, I just found this paradise of, just endless, places to fish.
And it's interesting too, because, you're super close, obviously, to salt water, but you still prefer to fish for freshwater species. What keeps bringing you back to the bass and the bluegill?
I think the giggles. It's just happy fishing. I would rather go out and, when I take somebody out bluegill fishing or bass fishing, it's just fun. It's refreshing. In saltwater, which is, certainly has its, it has its place, and I enjoy it, but when you come in from a day of saltwater fishing, you're exhausted. You usually take a nap. When you come home from freshwater fishing, you're refreshed. That's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, it's really neat. We have a pond in our neighborhood, and I love taking my boys out and fishing after dinner. I think it's a ton of fun, and so I kind of share that love of bluegill and largemouth bass. How is the angling experience on the freshwater different in Florida than other parts of the country?
I would say that probably the biggest difference that I would say it's not uncommon even in the summer for me to fish a popper all day long. We don't have a lot of. It's usually thought of as being low light early and late. But here it's really shade and not shade. So if I can find a shady shoreline at 1:00 in the afternoon, I'm pretty sure I can catch some fish. Fishing under lily pads, we have a lot of lily pads and some great swampy kinds of places, and the fish eat all day. It's pretty interesting. We don't have a lot of deep water. It's in the places that I fish anyway. So the fish just find shade.
Yeah, and since you have, I guess, probably a longer season, are the fish larger in Florida, kind of like they are in Texas and Mexico and places like that?
They are not necessarily the ones that I catch, but I mean, certainly, at Lake Okeechobee or, someplace it's not uncommon to catch 9 and 10 pound fish. For me, an 18 inch bass is that's my favorite. We get them bigger sometimes on flies, but it's pretty easy to catch big ones on shiners and live bait, that sort of thing. But for fly fishing, we get a lot in the 15 to 18 inch range. And to me, that's I judge them a little differently, rather than the size. I love to look at them. I mean, to me, a 15-inch bass that's shaped like a torpedo is a real trophy. I just marvel at them when I see them.
Yeah, and also there's those different shades of green. I think is just amazing too.
Yeah, we have a couple of all bass down here are Florida strain bass. That's all that they're allowed to stock. There's a type of one strain which I call a canal bass. That's probably not accurate, but they're very dark on the back and very kind of buttery on the bottom. And they're just magnificent fish, and they fight, I believe, differently than northern bass. Maybe a little more like a smallmouth. On top of that, we have a lot of stuff down here. We have Oscars and cichlids. We have exotics, peacock bass, which were actually planted here. It's not an invasive, but it's not uncommon when we fish the freshwater Everglades to catch 9 species of fish a day.
Yeah, that's really neat. And also folks know you as an outdoor writer. When did the writing bug hit you?
I don't know that it ever did. My background's advertising, so I've always written headlines and written ads and that sort of stuff. I never thought of myself as a writer. I never, anything more than a paragraph, I didn't even consider. When things got really slow in the advertising business probably 15 years ago, I put together some. I thought, my wife asked me, what would you like to do if you could do anything? So I'd like to illustrate and write, fishing articles or whatever. I don't even think I said write, but so I did some illustrations of different things, knots and that sort of stuff, and sent them out to all the magazine editors, and I got a call from Jay Nichols at Stackpole, and he saw one of the knots, and he goes, would you be interested in illustrating a knot book? And I said, well, sure, that'd be great. We talked for about 45 minutes and about knots and that kind of stuff. He goes, you know this stuff pretty well. Why don't you just write the book? And I said, I'm not really a writer. He said, I tell you what, you write it and I'll fix it. And that was my first writing assignment. So I wrote 2 books, one Essential Knots and Rigs for Trout and Essential Knots and Rigs for Saltwater.
That's pretty neat. So your first writing assignment was a book, and I'm sure you got paid for it too.
I did, yeah, and continue to do so. So that's really nice. It's been as far as fishing books go, it's been pretty successful.
Yeah, I know for a fact I've got your knot book on my bookcase behind me here in my office.
Yeah, it's the process for me it's a little bit different. I don't really do an outline or something. I love doing the casting articles. I work quite a bit with Fly Fisherman magazine, and when I get an idea, what I do first is I do sketches, and then I do illustrations, and then I write about them. So I really, the best advice I could give somebody if they want to be an outdoor writer is learn to draw. It makes it really appealing to an editor if everything, if you're a great photographer or if you're a good illustrator or something, it really pushes your story along. Really makes it a lot more appealing.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. So you really kind of work backwards from the storyboards that you create.
Absolutely backwards. Absolutely, yeah.
And so in terms of, we'll use writing, and obviously it's different process for you than from a lot of other folks. Is that something that you try to do in the off season, or do you kind of try to work it into your kind of, weekly routine?
No, I do it when I have something to write about. When I have something that, that the last one I did for Fly Fisherman magazine was called No Fly Zone. And it was basically how not to hit other people with your fly, how to be, courteous in the boat. And that came from me getting hit in the head with a fly from someone. So, it was like, okay, this needs to be addressed. And so that was, yeah. One day I lost a couple of, I had somebody out and we lost a couple of flies, and I came back and I wrote an article called The Rules of Disengagement. And it's 10 ways to get your fly out of the tree. So we left a lot hanging in the tree that day, but never again. So.
Well, that's neat. So it's really not it's kind of a situational thing. It's kind of like getting hit by lightning, and then that's when you need to write the article, as opposed to kind of collecting things and then sitting down and cranking out articles.
It is. Yeah. It is that.
Yeah. And I know too, I think you're probably best known for being a casting instructor and a teaching guide. Can you tell us a little bit about how you kind of gravitated from fishing farm ponds in Indiana to becoming a casting instructor and a teaching guide?
Yeah. You know what? I have, I never would have ever considered, that teaching is an occupation for me, but there's nothing I love more than teaching people to fly cast. I love progress. I love watching somebody transform in just a couple of hours, or maybe less in some cases. I just have always sort of, helped people here and there and that sort of stuff. When I moved to Florida, I met Norm Ziegler, who owns a fly shop out on Sanibel, and wrote the book Snook on a Fly, and he started a shop, and it sort of started out, it's like, hey, this guy wants to learn to fly fish. Would you help him? And it just took off from there. And I now do I would guess about 200 private lessons a year, and some, clinics and that sort of thing. I much prefer one-on-one rather than a large group. I just really enjoy that one-on-one, or, maybe two people, something like that.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I've seen you do your casting demonstrations like at the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival, and seen some of your stuff online. And I think one of the really interesting things is you have a very practical, kind of non-dogmatic approach to casting instruction. In the sense of, there are a lot of people that's like, this is how you have to do it, and if you don't do it this way, it's the wrong way. And there's some things I noticed kind of in your casting style they're just different from kind of traditional approaches to teaching casting, like your index finger on top, your right foot forward, casting with the tip, right? And I'm just kind of curious, as you were on your casting journey, when did you sort of break away from that orthodoxy and make that style your own?
Yeah, it really started, some of it was just little things over the years. When I was 18 years old, I cut my finger at a job that I had, so my pinky doesn't bend. So the finger on top grip was always a natural for me. It was just more comfortable to hold it that way, because the pinky was essentially useless in casting. And then I had a guy one time that I met at a sports show, a guy named Don Atkinson, a good friend of mine now. But I met him, and he came up and he said, "Oh yeah, I used to fly fish, but I had shoulder surgery." And he'd been all the great places. He'd been Seychelles and Russia and all this stuff. But he said, "Yeah, but I don't do it anymore because I don't, I can't move my." I said, "Oh, you know what? Come over. We'll do a lesson." And then I kind of panicked because I thought, okay, this guy's going to come to my house and I'm going to send him to the hospital or something. So I spent 2 days. He was coming over on a Wednesday. I spent 2 days out in my yard thinking, okay, if I had, this limited range of motion, how would I cast? And I noticed as I was doing this, my casting got better and sharper and more concise. I'm just everything about it. And I thought, and it got easier. And I thought, well, yeah, and that was really the start of that. So from then on, I just became obsessed with how do I get the most out of the rod and the least out of me. There's a saying that if you want to find the easiest way to do something, give it to the laziest person. Well, I am the laziest person. I can tell you that. So,
and obviously your clients are believers when you show them. And I rewatched preparing for this interview your casting demonstration. I think from 2 years ago at the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival. How do you make let's just say more traditional casting instructors believers?
I guess by demonstration. I love hanging out with other good casters and discussing things and sharing things. I learn something all the time. I think just what I get a lot of times is, people say, boy, it looks so easy when you do that. It looks just, effortless when you do that. And if you want to learn to do that, I'm not saying it's the right way. I'm saying I think it's probably the easiest way. And that's what I like to do. But the other thing, the real challenge, I think, is when you have a student, all of us move differently. And sometimes it's working with that person where they are. Maybe this person's arm doesn't move the way mine does. So we got to figure out what's right for him, how best they can make that line move back and forth.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that was a big part of kind of Lefty's casting philosophy was that we all weren't built the same, so we all shouldn't necessarily cast the same.
Right. Yeah. I would say that if you're getting the line where you want it to go and you're having a good time, then you're probably doing it the right way. If you want to do it farther, you want to do it easier, then I can probably help with that. Otherwise, I'd say just go fishing.
There you go. And, you became a guide as well. Was that an outgrowth of looking for a bigger classroom setting, or was there another reason that you wanted to become a fishing guide?
Yeah. And, and I'm always really quick to say that we had an expression back in Indiana, a gentleman farmer, somebody that kind of farmed. They had a farm, but, sort of, did it at a leisurely pace. I am a gentleman fishing guide. So it's not what I do every day for a living. It's what my clients are typically people who take a lesson, and we do a lesson, and the next logical step is to put that into action out on the water. Now, my guiding's a little bit different because of the expectation. It's the focus. What I always tell people that, when we get back to the ramp, you're going to be better than when we started. That's a guarantee. That's a given. Whether we catch anything in the meantime is who knows. And so with that expectation, it takes the pressure off of the fishing part. I can always teach them. We can always pick up tips. The places that I go when I guide are very technical places. For example, one place I go, Lake Webb, has a lot of lily pads, and it has these really nice trails through the lily pads that kind of zigzag through. And one thing that we do is contour casting. We throw some curve casts around some stumps, and we go through the lily pads. We throw under the willows. Those kinds of things. Whether they catch something, they probably will, but the satisfaction of making that cast and putting it in the right spot is very, very rewarding.
And is that something that, you people will come to you and say, hey, I want to work on A, B, and C. Let's go out and work on that. Or are you kind of taking a more expansive, because I guess what I would call a traditional fishing guide, they can teach too, but generally they may be a little bit more focused on putting fish in the boat. How do you kind of determine your curriculum for your day on the water?
Typically, a lot of times people will call and they say, well, I can cast, whatever, 80 feet, but I just need to work on my double haul. Well, the truth of the matter is there's probably more to it than that. And, of course I'd say, yeah, we'll do that and that'll be great. But a lot of times I find out that the problems are a little bit more on the fundamental side than the higher, the hauling and that sort of thing.
And, in terms of bringing new people to the sport, Joe, what kind of suggestions do you have for how to introduce people in general, but maybe even specifically children to fly fishing?
So here's the thing about kids and I get some kids that, their parents will say, well, is 8 too young? Well, it's not too young if the kid has the interest. And if he has, again, it's finding out where, what his, intensity level is, I guess. So, one of my good fishing buddies is 8 years old, a kid named Elias. And I learned more from him. I get the enthusiasm and, from him, what I've learned is, and from having my own boys, the goal should be at the end of the day, that kid needs to say, that was a great time. I want to do that again. Now, in the meantime, they probably, it's important to know that sometimes you stop the boat and explore an island, or maybe it's time to throw rocks, throw sticks, or, get out on the sandbar and go crazy in the water. That's all part of it. And that's what I try and tell parents. It's like, okay, we'll teach him to cast, we'll get him or her to, get the fly where they need to do it. But keep in mind, their motivation isn't the same as yours. It probably isn't important to them that they catch a 20-inch rainbow today. They're probably, if they come back and they say, that was a great time, that was a successful trip.
Got it. And how does that approach change as you start teaching adults?
I don't think it should. I think that it's like, if you're not having a good time, put the rod down and whatever, take some pictures or something like that. Sometimes the hardest people I think to teach, and I've had several of them, and that's the guy that retires and his wife gets him a fly rod and says, "Here, you need a hobby." Poor guy doesn't know why he's got this thing or why he's doing it, but okay. The easiest people are probably people that transition from other kinds of fishing, because when they see something, when they see maybe a curve cast or something like that, this light goes on their head and they say, "Oh, I know exactly where I'm going to use this," or "I know exactly how I'm going to apply that technique."
Yeah, that's neat. I guess I've had a similar experience with the Project Healing Water guys. Even if they haven't fly fished before, you start seeing that light bulb go off when you talk about, remember when you were a kid and you went when you went fishing.
Yeah. We have down in Southwest Florida, we have a Project Healing Waters chapter down here, and the guys, it's amazing how quickly they pick it up and how much fun it is for them, even when they haven't really done it before. So,
yeah. And who are some of the folks, Joe, that have influenced you in your guiding career?
There's a fellow down in the Everglades, Captain John Hand. And, John's been great. He's been guiding for years. And, it really has a lot to do. I always say that fishing with John is like fishing with the Farmer's Almanac. Certainly, a great fly fishing guide and instructor, but the stuff that he knows about the area, the stuff that he knows about the birds and stuff that he, that to me, it really rounds out the whole experience. Pine Island Sound, a good friend of mine, Blake Matherly, is just the nicest gentleman out on the water. And, I'm always quick to recommend him to people, and they always come back and say that was just a great day. Even when the fishing's not great, they'll learn things. They come back to the ramp with things they didn't have when they got on the boat. That's the best way I can put it.
No, it's interesting because it's funny because I have similar conversations with friends about, sometimes you can have a great guide day and you may not catch any or many fish. And it's, it's always say the guide's job is the denominator and the angler's job is the numerator. And sometimes the denominator is just not very big.
Right. Yeah. 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 I think that when you come back, the best trips I've had haven't been the best fish days. That it's the days that you come back with some great memories.
Yeah, I agree. And, another tradition we have on the Articulate Fly is I have to always ask all of my guests that guide to share what they think the biggest misconception people have about the life of a fishing guide.
Huh. That's an interesting one. I'd say that they maybe not understand the hours that go beyond the fishing. Typically coming by, mine's a little bit different, as I said, because I'm kind of a gentleman guide. I do it, when when I want to do it, essentially. But doing it day after day, there's a lot to do. There's tying flies at night. There's cleaning the boat down. There's, fixing fly lines, putting new leaders on, all that sort of stuff. So it really goes on a little bit longer than you might think.
Yeah, those guys put in long days, particularly when you got to run, to and from the clients, plus get ready, before and after for sure. And, one thing I know too, Joe, is that you helped design a series of rods with the folks at Riley Rod Crafters. How did that relationship come about?
That came about. I was working with New Canoe, the kayak company. At one point, they had a booth at Virginia Wine Festival, and I went. I was doing a talk on fly fishing from a kayak, and I had a rod. I don't even remember what it was, and I got done. I walked off of the casting pond there, and Chuck Kraft, who just passed away a few weeks ago, sadly. Came up to me and he had a rod in his hand. He says, that was a right fine program, young man. He goes, here, next time use this rod. And he hands me the Riley Rod CK series, the Chuck Kraft series. And I said, sure, fine. So I did the next one, and I can tell you that was the sweetest casting rod I've ever held. And that was the CK7 weight. And, yep. And so time went on, and Chris Riley and I got to be friends, and I was using the CK, and I don't even know how it came up, but the idea was that I would design some rods. Now, when I say design rods, I'm going to put a disclaimer. I didn't do any math. I didn't do any. I really don't know that stuff. I mean, I know a little bit about how rods are constructed, but what I told Chris was, I said, I've always enjoyed slower action rods. I've always liked to teach with slower action rods. I know I know people learn faster, and even experienced fishermen, I think, probably do really well with slower action. So I told Chris, I want a rod that casts like they did 20 years ago, that dampen like today's rods. And that's what we did. That's where we ended up with the series, the lily pad and the cypress.
Got it. I'm kind of bummed out because I was going to ask you what your favorite CAD program was.
My favorite what?
Your CAD program.
Oh yeah, no idea. Yeah, I just don't know that stuff. I got to pick out some cool colors, and maybe most importantly, I got to design the grip, which I have always for years. When I was a kid, I had a old bamboo rod that had a flat spot on the cork, and I always loved that. And so over the years, I would take sandpaper and file down the corks on my rods. And so this came about, and I asked Chris, I said, can we put a flat spot on there? The thinking is, or what I believe happens, is that your finger is cylindrical and the cork is cylindrical. So there's always a balancing act going on. With a flat spot, you have a solid platform to apply the power. And I cast with my finger on top, although it works just as well with your thumb. Either way is right. and it gave us a nice place to put my little alligator logo on there. So I use the 6-weight, the lily pad, the 5.6 for just about everything I do, and then in saltwater I use the 7.8 Cypress.
Very cool. And kind of stepping back just a little bit, how do those rods dovetail with your casting and your teaching philosophy?
Yeah. So generally what I see, or oftentimes what I see, is that when people show up, they'll have a rod that maybe they bought that's just way too fast for them. And there's certainly a place for that if you're, fishing for bonefish and, high winds and that kind of stuff. There's nothing better than having a super fast rod. For day-to-day fishing, it's probably maybe not the best choice. So when I get somebody, a lot of times if I know that if I get the rod in their hand, they're probably going to do a little better. There's a lot of times people will actually order them or want to buy one. So for me, it was there were some rods back in that I've had over the years that I just get a better result from people, and that's really where that really helps with the action.
Yeah, it also kind of keeps you from going down that rabbit hole of over and underlining rods too.
Yeah, I would say, I tend, if anything, I underline the rods. If like on the 5.6 weight, the 5 weight really works better for a dry fly action. A 6 weight works better for throwing poppers, that sort of thing. But rarely do people ever underline the rods. They overline them because they like that feel, but it's kind of a feel good feature. It doesn't really help.
No, absolutely. And I know, that you do a lot of teaching, in addition to your private lessons. I think you probably monthly or weekly are offering classes at Bass Pro just in kind of general fishing knowledge, but also tying. How is COVID-19 impacting your ability to kind of get out and reach all of your students?
Well, I've canceled everything. I think I had 9 charters scheduled, 8 or 9. And those were all, people that just didn't get on an airplane that just canceled, which, it's fine. I canceled lessons because I tend to, just the nature of that, you're pretty close to somebody. So the classes at Bass Pro that we do tying on Wednesday night, and then I do a casting demo the first Saturday of every month, and that's all canceled. It's just too high risk, I think.
Yeah, I imagine the best thing to do is to just kind of reach out to you by email to see when they come back online, because it seems like the new normal these days is basically everything's closed until we tell you that it's not.
Right. Yeah. So I'm always available for over the phone advice or the emails, that sort of thing.
Should we encourage people to send you videos of casting?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I got nothing to do. I'm sitting here twiddling my thumbs here for the next couple of weeks. So
download Coach's Eye or something like that, folks, and you can or just use your phone or your iPad, and you can tape yourself casting, and you can learn a ton just by having a buddy do that with you.
Yeah, it is. It's great. I enjoy doing lessons with 2 people because when it's interesting how when 2 people leave, how each one of them will have different takeaways. And so that, husband and wife or, something like that, I think it's very beneficial. And, it's also kind of a fun, it gives you a little bit of relief. So they're not just constantly being, watched or whatever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's nice to be able to work on something and kind of get a break and then come back and get a little bit more instruction. And so, while we're kind of in this holding pattern, why don't you let folks know where they can find you on the internet so that when you're back in action, they can reach out to you and get a lesson or book you for a day on the water? Absolutely.
They can find me at joemahler.com. It's Joe, Mahler.com. Joe at joemahler.com is my email. And if they want to watch a video, if they've got 45 minutes to kill, it's if they go onto YouTube and look up Effortless Fly Casting. That was a video that my friend Debbie Hansen held her cell phone up in the air for 45 minutes, just as steady as can be, and that was at the Virginia show.
Yeah, and the audio was really good. I'll drop that in the show notes to the episode so people can find it because it's super helpful. And it's a good investment for just under 45 minutes. I think you've got a couple thousand downloads now, Joe.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I haven't looked at it for a while, so good.
Yeah, a couple thousand downloads because I brought my youngest son in to watch it while I was getting ready for our interview, and I was like, I think it had close to 2,000.
Wow. Well, great.
Yeah, it's all good, and we'll try to get you another 500 or so out of this episode. I appreciate you spending some time with me this afternoon, and it's really been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a blast. Thanks so much.
Okay. Take care now.
You too. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Again, a shout out to this episode's sponsor, the folks at Bristol Bay Defense Fund. Go visit www.bristolbaydefensefund.com and donate today. And again, if you like the podcast, please tell a friend, subscribe in the podcatcher of your choice, and leave us a review. Thanks, everybody. Tight lines.